Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Ben West, and we are joined today by Sarah Elkins. Sarah, welcome to Magic in the Room. Glad you're here.
Thank you. It's an honor to come back.
So today we are talking about strengths, and we'll get into more kind of Sarah's story, but she is an expert in helping people understand their strengths and understand how to live in them. And I'll just say for me personally, just in a few interactions I've had with Sarah, she's helped me even understand some of my strengths with more clarity, and we'll talk about that more later on in the episode. But first, before we do that, I just want to give some context. So by way of reminder, we are in this series on intentional leadership, which is noticing things in the world around us, making choices about how we can make things better, and then acting on those choices, having courage to take that action. That's intentional leadership, but kind of feeding into intentional leadership is all these other things about us. So the things that we notice are impacted by our values, by our experiences. And today we're talking about strengths, how the things that are our strengths impact the choices that we make and the way that we are leaders. So just a reminder that there's a guide that goes with this episode. Go to magicintheroom.com and you can download that guide, and it will help you just do some reflection to apply some of the things that we're talking about today. So go find that and it'll be helpful to you. So let's dive in. So Hannah, why don't you introduce Sarah? Let our guests know why we wanted Sarah to come talk about strengths with us.
Yeah. So, Sarah, welcome back. I should say you've been on our podcast several times already. So for long-time listeners, you've probably heard multiple episodes featuring Sarah. Sarah is a good friend of mine, a fellow Montanan, and Sarah's based in Helena and does some really great work coaching people around how to use their strengths in their day-to-day work, but more specifically with a lens of storytelling. Sarah is a storytelling coach, so she helps people kind of connect their strengths with the stories they tell and use stories to demonstrate their strengths when they introduce themselves, when they apply for jobs, when they are part of any kind of interaction, right? How can we demonstrate our strengths and what we're good at with the stories that we tell? So Sarah's got a wealth of resources in both of the arenas of stories and strengths, and wrote a book called Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, with I think there's a companion workbook in the works, Sarah, is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, there is. There's a companion. There's actually a course called Job Interview Storytelling. So it goes along, people have read the book and then realized that it would be helpful to have a specific course around storytelling for job interviews. So now there's a course out there as well.
Wonderful. Well, we're so happy to have you back, Sarah, to kind of help us dive deeper into the topic of strengths. So before we dive into strengths themselves, why don't you tell us a little bit, kind of a brief background on what led you to this work and what got you interested in strengths?
I love this question because I spent nearly 20 years in the public sector. I worked with federal agencies in Washington, D.C. I moved to Montana and worked with state agencies. And then I worked with a local government agency here in Montana. And what I realized is that there are so many people who provide direct services to our communities that do really great work, but their stories aren't told very well because the leadership doesn't understand what they do. So there's a big disconnect, and there are all these people that care deeply for their communities, and then they're not treated very well because people don't know what they do and how well they do it. And they don't love their jobs after a while, and they become complacent. And that's where you hear about government employees and all the negative connotation that comes with that. And coming out of government agencies, what I really wanted was to help people like their jobs again. And I found that by uncovering their natural talents, their strengths, and helping them understand what that means in teams, so they don't feel like they have to do everything themselves, and so that they can bring their best selves to work and encourage others to do the same, that it just makes life more satisfying. And that's my goal. I would love for especially government employees, but all employees, to start liking their jobs again.
I love how you phrased that. We want people to start liking their jobs again. And the cool thing for me, and I've taken the Strengths Finder assessment, which, or Gallup Strengths, whatever we call it. It's gone through a few different name iterations over the years, and I'm sure we'll get into that particular assessment a little bit too. But I've taken that 3 times over the course of my, over about 15 years. Over the course of my career. And each time when I've taken the assessment, I've been in some kind of transition, right? Where I'm either ready to take the next step, or I'm honing in on, where I really want to head with my career, or the work that I do. I've gotten more clear on my purpose and my values, and how to really tap into my natural talents and to develop skills within those areas. And so for me, it's been really transformational, because I've 100% gone through that experience of, when I feel that I'm operating in my strengths, I love what I do. When I've had roles where I was not operating in my strengths, I hated my job, or at least certain aspects of it, and I wasn't very good at it. I struggled, or I just wasn't motivated to even try that hard. So, if you want to like your job, make sure you figure out what your strengths are.
Sarah, I have a question for you. As you have kind of done this work with a lot of people, what's just 1 or 2 stories of the change that you've seen in people as they've kind of learned this idea that we can focus on and lean into our strengths? We don't have to define ourselves by the things that we're not good at. Like, what's the change that kind of comes over people as they learn this?
Well, I can start with my own, because I think it's important as a coach to acknowledge where you're learning for yourself, and then being able to help others learn similar lessons. When I first saw my results, I was really discouraged, because the things that came up at the top were the things that I had been criticized about a lot over the years. And with my first coach, I hired somebody to walk me through my results. And I said, these aren't strengths, these are burdens. This command thing, this is why my mom always called me bossy. And this activator and adaptability, this is why people called me impulsive. And my coach was able to help me walk through evidence that those were absolutely strengths when they were presented and used appropriately for a situation. So for instance, one of my biggest aha moments was when I remembered that after my mother's second husband died, I showed up at her house, and my sister and my mom's identical twin sister, had been there for a few days. I arrived, and my mom collapsed into my arms, sobbing, and said, "Thank goodness you're here. Now I know everything will be okay." That's my command. And when it shows up well, it helps people. It helps me. The other example of a big transformational experience would be when I was just working with a client who was looking for a job. And we had been working together a couple of months. I had her strengths in front of me, and I asked her about her last interview and what she thought went wrong. And I realized almost immediately where her strengths were not being managed properly. So one of her talents was, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, one of her talents was up at a 9 or a 10, and the other one was down at a 2. And I was able to describe how to use that other talent that she was neglecting in order to make a more successful interview. And I can tell you that immediately following the interview, 15 minutes after, she sent me a text message and said, that was what I needed in that moment. And even if I don't get the job, I feel so much more confident that I presented my best self in the interview. And I teared up. I have to admit it. My eyes welled up a little bit because I was so relieved that to have this confirmation that what I was doing was having a positive impact.
We were talking a little bit before we got on about how just like being willing to see these things, these strengths, and then being willing to own them, like just that step is a big change. So thanks for sharing those stories. Maybe what we can do is Hannah and I have a story we want to tell, and you can give us some coaching around this story. But before we do that, if you don't mind, Sarah, can you just give some context? Like when we talk about Strength Finder, what is it? What does it measure? Just a little bit of background on that, because it is part of the story that we're going to tell. So just to make sure that people kind of have that context.
It's now called Clifton Strengths. It used to be Gallup's Strengths Finder. And it's an assessment very similar to Myers-Briggs and DISC and Real Colors. It's very, I find it to be highly accurate. And my husband says, well, if Google can predict your behavior, Gallup probably can too. So for our listeners, this particular assessment I like because it presents humans in all of their complexity. It doesn't narrow you down to a label of 4 letters or a color or one number with wing numbers, which I like all of those assessments, but I don't see them as very easily lending themselves to understanding the complexity of how we approach problem solving as humans and individuals. That said, I use this particular tool because I find it, the way that I can present it is to say, this is what you're really, really good at. Any of these tools are useful if you are open to understanding them beyond a label and being able to understand ahead of time what somebody's natural talents are. Say, if there's a new employee on your team, then you can easily start to understand expectations for communication and how they might approach a problem. And because even when we're all speaking the same language, we're often not speaking the same language. So rather than guessing at somebody's strengths, you actually just have the answers in front of you, and it just shortcuts that duration of the getting to know you phase of anything, dating, hiring, and starting a new job.
Yeah, I love that differentiation too, Sarah, that you alluded to is, all these types of assessments, personality assessments, personality tests, whatever we call them, right? They have, each of them measure kind of a lens, like it has a lens on one aspect of personality, right? And so I love all of them because the more of them I take, the more different nuances I see and can learn about myself and the people around me. I agree. I really like this one because what Don Clifton set out to do was really about measuring what's right with people, not what's wrong with them. And, from a positive psychology perspective, I really connect with that idea, right? And then the differentiation between talent and strengths, right? When we understand what we're naturally talented at, and that can take some time over the course of our lives to really discover that, right? But taking this assessment will give you a much quicker, accurate indication of these are areas of talent. They may not necessarily be strengths for you yet because you may not have had the experiences and the opportunities to build skills within those areas yet. But once we're aware of, okay, these are things that I'm actually really talented at, I have natural talent and I'm naturally good at these things, I can start to focus in those areas and seek out experiences that will allow me to learn skills, and I can seek out courses, classes, educational pathways, career pathways that will help me build those build skills in those areas of talents so that they become true strengths. So I think it's a really powerful assessment. And yeah, I've, like Ben mentioned, both of us, we spent some time in Chicago recently with you and the No Longer Virtual Tribe. And, that's a conference that you host that we've talked about here before. But um, we had a little bit of an epiphany the Chicago during the Chicago NLB conference this year, and when it comes to strengths.
Yeah, should we just tell this story? And then
Okay.
Sarah, I'm pretty interested to hear your reaction to it. So maybe I'll tell my side first, and then Hannah, you can kind of tell your side. So here's what happened for me. So before NLV, I took Strength Finder or Clifton Strengths. I have to get used to this new name, but which I'd taken it before. But this time, one of the strengths that rose to the top was this idea of restorative, and it had never been on my list before, but it definitely connects. Like, I see it. So the idea of restorative, and I'm just going to leave just read the description, the short description, just for people who are listening. It says, people who are especially talented in the restorative theme are an adept at dealing with problems. They are good at figuring out what is wrong and resolving it. So that's kind of the short description. And the way that this kind of shows up for me, one of the ways is that I'm pretty good at kind of starting with just like a blank sheet of paper and lots of ideas floating around and pulling them into something that starts and is kind of cohesive. And so you mentioned at the conference that people who have restorative as a strength are good at taking something. I think the phrase that you said was like from 0 to 7. So seeing something that needs to be solved and getting that solution started, and then other people who are maximizers or have other strengths are good at taking it from that 7 up to 11. And so the reason that it was like a helpful insight for me personally was just because I tend to do things where like I do a first pass at it, I get it where it's good enough, and then I kind of get bored with it. And so the thing that I was like, the realization that I made from that and that I started being willing to embrace is like that's okay. Like, that's not a flaw, that I have to take everything all the way to its maximum limit. So that was kind of the personal insight. But then the other insight was just that, like, if that's true, then I have to have somebody who can take it from 7 to 11, right? Because it can't stay at 7. And so Hannah, I'm kind of curious your perspective now, because just the timing of how this worked out with the project that we have going on, maybe you can tell about that and how we're kind of learning to work together to make one of our products better.
Yeah. So, Ben shared kind of the definition of the restorative theme that he discovered when he took this latest iteration of Clifton Strengths. And so for me, one of my themes is maximizer. And the maximizer theme is all about really it's about taking something that's already good and making it really great. It's kind of like that over the top, make it even better kind of strength, right? So the context of the project that Ben alluded to is actually this whole series that we're talking about, intentional leadership, right? We have a program that we implement in organizations that's called Leadership Essentials, Leading Yourself, and these concepts of intentional leadership are part of that program, right? And so we've implemented this program in a few different organizations. And during the NLB conference, we were aware that there was an element of the program that could be better, right? We had noticed that something could be better. We needed to choose a course of action. And so we actually used one of the sessions in the NLB conference that was about innovation, and we applied this innovation technique to innovating, and we came up with a decision, right? And so we decided what needed to be better or how we could make it better, and then we took action on it. And so the beautiful thing that happened was that, Ben, with his restorative strength, had created this amazing foundation for this program. And enter Maximizer, right? We have this great foundation, and I'm like, I love this program. It's really good. It's very solid. And now we have a clear decision on how we're going to improve it. And I got to jump in and start actually making the improvements, because as a maximizer talent, the description is people exceptionally talented in the maximizer theme focus on strengths as a way to stimulate personal and group excellence. They seek to transform something strong into something superb. So now I'm getting to use my strengths in enhancing and elevating the experience of this program by making some necessary changes, but I get to be creative about it. I get to use some of the skills and tools that I like working in. We've kind of added a different element to the program that I get to design. And for me, that's really fun because I didn't have to go through kind of that early stage of creating something from nothing. I can take something that's already great and I can make it even better. So now Ben and I get to both operate in our strengths, right? Ben got it to a 7. I'm working on getting it to at least a 9, but I know it can go to 11.
So that's the story. So Sarah, like, what do you hear? What stands out just from your perspective about all of that?
Well, first, I love the Spinal Tap reference. And for the listeners of this episode, be sure and look up on YouTube, Spinal Tap Amp to 11. Because if you haven't seen that, especially that part with Rob Reiner, you'll want to watch it because maximizers are the 11s on the amplifier. So first, I love that we referred to that again because I love that movie. Second, I'd like to ask you a question, Ben. In the past, when you have had somebody, maybe with Maximizer, now that you look back, where you were done with something and they were saying, oh no, it could be better. How did you feel about that? Do you remember having frustration with that?
I can't think of like a specific example, but yes. And I think that there's kind of 2 levels to it. One is like me feeling like I should be able to do all of it, right? Like, if it's not good enough yet, why can't I be the one that makes it good enough? And so then like you get frustrated at yourself, like, but I'm not disciplined enough or whatever to like keep pushing this thing, but really I'm just bored with it. So that's part of it. And then also there's just like this part of it also of like, for me, sometimes good enough is good enough, and why don't other people see it that way? But being willing to let go of that and say, no, like it can be better if I'm willing to let go of it. So I think both of those things are true.
Yes, that's what I was looking for. And then Hannah, on the flip side, have you found that you get frustrated when you have these ideas and people aren't listening to you?
Oh, 100%. And yeah, like what also makes me really frustrated is when I see something that could be really great, but it's just kind of average. And when people don't seem to be willing to kind of go that extra mile, right, to make it as great as it could be, that can be really frustrating to me. But because I'm also, part of the whole maximizer theme is that you're like obsessed with strengths, right? I love strengths. I love finding my own strengths. I love seeing strengths in others. I love looking for what could be great about someone. And that's part of my personal purpose too, right? Is to seek out greatness in people and help to invite that and amplify people's strengths. So, for me, it's not so much that I'm frustrated when I encounter that, but I'm always, like it kind of baffles me when people don't seem interested in in like being great at something or making something that's already good into something great, right? I don't love working with average. I love working with excellent, superb, beautiful, amazing.
So there are two things that came up in this conversation. I'm going to start with you, Hannah. One is when you were talking about your purpose in your maximizer, I'd like to point out that that's not for every maximizer. Not every maximizer looks for the strengths in others in terms of individuals. They're not always focused on the people. Some maximizers are more focused on a task. But because you start with connectedness as your number one talent, which is in the relationship building domain, and then you have individualization as bookends to your maximizer, individualization is also relationship building. You focus your maximizer on people. And because of the individualization, you have this uncanny ability to know what motivates the person in front of you.
Thank you for that way of connecting multiple strengths, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And obviously, yes, you have my Clifton Strength results. And what's fascinating to me is that when you're able to start combining your strengths, right? How it becomes clear how you as an individual can show up in a very unique way, right? Because your way of applying the strength is different from somebody else's because of the other strengths and values that are at play.
Exactly. So the other thing that came up was that when you said, I'm baffled when somebody doesn't want to take it from good to great or good to exceptional. And that's the key to our strengths is we know we're in the pocket of our strengths when we get frustrated or baffled by how somebody else operates. We just can't imagine. How can you not see this? Right? And I find this in myself because I have strategic and activator. That's how I lead. And I immediately, like Ben, and you also have strategic, the way that shows up for me is I immediately know the most efficient way to get from point A to point B. And because of my activator, I just go. I just start. I don't deliberate. I don't collect information. I just go. And what I love about the talents in this room, in this magical room where we're sitting together today, is that we all have such complementary talents that I would reach out to you or to Ben to help me with my blind spots. I need that analytical and that learner, the analytical in Ben and the learner in you, to remind me to turn down my dial on my amplifier, on my activator, and actually learn a few things and figure out what obstacles I might hit before I head down any particular path. I have to be humble enough to know that I need those strengths in my wheelhouse, even if I don't own them, if they're not part of me. The other thing that popped in, Ben, was when you were talking about feeling like I should be able to do this and knowing now that your magic starts first. Before Hannah can even touch something, we have to acknowledge your magic in the room, which is that restorative, that ability to start something from scratch. And what I loved about that is that we have to know as a restorative that sometimes a maximizer might insult us. We've put in the work, we've done what we wanted to do to get it to this point, and somebody might say, oh, but it could be better, and you're just exhausted. You're thinking, no, I'm done. This is good enough.
Right. Yeah.
And so it can be insulting. My husband will say, oh, just add capers. That'll make even better. And capers are like the maximizer of the food world. They make everything better. At the same time, when somebody that's a maximizer like Hannah makes a suggestion to me, and my first reaction is, oh my gosh, really? Getting insulted. My next reaction is, oh, if Hannah has an idea to make this better, it's already good. And I can take that as a huge compliment.
I'm just thinking about this in the context kind of leadership, and I think the parallels are there, but maybe Sarah, if you can make them explicit, if you were kind of leading the team of Hannah and I, what's the intentional things that you are doing knowing this about us now?
That's such a good question. I think first, I have to look at my own talents and know where how I approach things might conflict with how you approach things. For instance, I have adaptability in my top talents. And as a leader, that can come across as unpredictable to the people that I'm trying to lead. So I have to know mine first. And then when I know yours, I can ask you, based on the tasks that need to be completed, how you would complete them to make sure that I am not saying, well, I would do it this way. This is how you have to do it. Because your approach to solving a problem is going to be different from mine. We're both going to get from point A to point B, but the route we're going to take is going to look different. And I need to know generally what route you might take and what obstacles you might hit and what resources you might need in order to be successful.
I want to kind of move to some application, but before we do that, Hannah, what's kind of your closing thoughts on just this coaching session that we got to have with Sarah?
Well, first of all, that was beautiful, Sarah. I really appreciate how you helped both Ben and I recognize how like what's unique about the way we apply our strengths, and just understand better, right? Why we sometimes have felt frustrated in the past when we don't encounter that strength, or maybe why we don't understand why not everybody operates the way we do, right? And that's the whole point of raising self-awareness, which is the core of intentional leadership, right? Is to start noticing. So when we take an assessment such as Clifton Strengths, we start becoming more aware, right, of what we're good at, and we can start noticing more how we're using those strengths. When we're not using our strengths, we can notice what are strengths of others, and we can notice, like we can notice more the way you did, Sarah, as a leader, right? How to create a team that does amazing work because of how we combine strengths and how we work intentionally together within our strengths, not outside of our strengths.
Yeah, that idea that it's all about intention, like you have to notice these things about the people around you and about yourself and then act on it. So Sarah, I'll give this question to you first, and then Hannah to you. So in a lot of ways, like the three of us are, we're very fortunate because we get to take these assessments, and then I got to sit in a room with the two of you, and Sarah shared this idea about how maximizers and restorative fits together. So we're kind of immersed in this world, right? And so, but I'm wondering, Sarah, from your perspective, just for listeners who are kind of like, they're listening to this and like, oh, there's something here. I want to understand my strengths more, or I want to be willing to embrace those things more. Like, what's just some places to start? How do you get started on this journey of understanding and really living into your strengths?
Well, first, I think it's important that if you are curious about this particular assessment, you know that you can take it. You pay, I think it's $59.99 for the full list. Don't bother with the top 5. I know a lot of StrengthsFinder coaches suggest you start with the top 5. I find that having the full list is really helpful because I know what's at the bottom of my list. And as a solopreneur, that means I understand what resources I need to be successful as a solopreneur. I can surround myself with people with the strengths that are at the bottom of my list, or at a minimum, have tools, technology to help me with those blind spots. So you can take it. I also recommend that at a minimum, you schedule time with a coach that's familiar with this particular tool, because it's great to read through it, but it's harder to apply if you don't know where it's already showing up in your daily life. So that's where I would get started. And remember also that you can figure out generally what you're really good at by simply looking at the times at work in your income producing activities that you felt really satisfied with something you did, whether it was conversational or a task or a project program. Figure out what that was and what about it specifically you really enjoyed. Was it that you were interacting with a lot of different people? Was it that you had formed deep relationships with people? Was it that you got to create an extensive spreadsheet or database that was really useful and you were collecting a ton of information? All of those aspects of whatever you're doing give you clues about where your strengths are.
Yeah, that's a really great call out, Sarah. And I would agree, now that I've taken this particular assessment 3 times on average every 5 years over the past 15 years, because the first 2 times I took it, I only got my top 5. And there was some switching. There were a couple of my top themes that showed up both of those times in my top 5. But there were some new ones that came in, kind of like Ben alluded to. There was a new one, restorative, that showed up, right? Well, when I got my whole list revealed, and just for context for listeners who haven't taken this assessment, there are 34 different themes, right? And really who you are in your top 10. And so all of those that have ever showed up in my top 5 are in my top 10. They are there. They've been there all along. It's been a little bit up to the context that I've been in, the role that I've been in, the stage of life that I've been in, which of those rose to the very, very top, right? Actually, I should take that back. There's one that's my number 11 now that has been, 15 years ago was in my top 5. But the general point is the top 10 or 11, because mine always goes to 11. They are who you are. They describe who you are. Your bottom 10 or 11 really describe who you are not. So once we see that, right, it's a relief, because we can let go of trying to be someone we're not. When I see that, that consistency is my number 34. If I just try really, really hard to be consistent, I'm going to feel like a failure every single day. And yet I still manage to be consistent in the things that are really important in my life, because I draw on other strengths, right? I'm able to achieve consistency in key areas, not because I have consistency as a strength, but because I have these other strengths and I understand how to apply them.
I love what you said, Hannah, for a couple of other reasons too. And one is simply that, like I said before, I'm going to approach something in a different way because of my top strengths. I'm still going to get it done. And that's the beauty of understanding them, is what you just said, which is you're not going to use a strength that's at the bottom of your list in order to approach a task, but you're still going to approach the task and be successful with it. You're just going to use your tools that you have available.
So Sarah, how do you think about kind of the changes that people do see in strengths if they kind of take the assessment over time? Is that kind of driven by context? I'm just kind of curious about that, because like Hannah said, and it was true for me, I've taken it twice, and within the top 10, is pretty much the same, but they kind of shifted around some. So
Mhm.
what do you see? Like, does it change for people, or is it pretty steady? How do you think about those changes?
Well, I have two thoughts about that. One is, in general, you don't see significant changes after around age 35. And my theory, I don't have any proof, my theory is that up until that point, you are being exposed to a variety of ways of approaching things. So you don't know necessarily what you're good at or how you're good at it until you've been exposed to multiple ways of approaching problem solving. So different mentors, different bosses, different jobs. And I do see big, significant changes after significant transformation in people's lives. So this could be a significant traumatic event. It could be a big transformation from being married to being divorced, or empty nesting, having your children move out, really switching into a very completely different job and industry. Because again, you're being exposed to it in different ways. In general, I don't see significant changes. And the second part of this is that I know a lot of people like to take a lot of different assessments. And that's what Hannah was saying earlier. And what I found recently, and maybe it's just because I'm strategic, that's my number one talent, and this is how my brain works. Somebody gave me an assessment to take a few weeks ago, and I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll just take another assessment. And I found myself answering the questions the way I knew my StrengthsFinder results were accurate. So I don't know if I was skewing it because of my StrengthsFinder assessment, or if maybe I wasn't skewing it because it was my StrengthsFinder. But either way, I realized, okay, there are some assessments that, because of the way they ask you the questions, you can skew it if you've taken enough assessments or are familiar enough with this kind of work, that if you take it more than once, you're just going to play the system in one way or another. So I encourage you to not take it more than once.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
if you're going to take other assessments, make sure they're really different. Like Enneagram, those questions are really different from what you get in StrengthsFinder and DISC. And so there are other assessments that you can take to continue to learn about yourself and how you approach things.
Sarah, if you don't mind, could you remind us of, you kind of have this philosophy that you've mentioned about assessments, like to take one that focuses on strengths, not telling you what to fix. So why is that? Why is that important as people are kind of thinking about how to learn more about their strengths?
That's such a good question. And I'll go back to that first part of the conversation when I mentioned seeing things in my top talents that felt like burdens to me because of the criticisms that I had experienced in my life. It's hard to own your talents, the things you're good at, when people have criticized you for those exact things, especially people that you admire or respect that are caregivers. So what I would encourage people to think about is that when you take an assessment, whatever the assessment, know that what's coming to the surface as far as how your brain works is not broken. This is the part of you that, if this is how your brain works, as Hannah said, use this to your full advantage. It's like finding out that that I have incredible lung capacity and I could be a swimmer. Like, oh, well, then that's what I need to be doing. If I could be really extraordinary at something, I want to know what that is, and I want to be able to do it. So I'm 5'2". I'm never going to be a professional basketball player. And I may love basketball and be really, really good at it because I practice and I'm so passionate about it, but I will never be extraordinary at it like somebody who is taller and has more of the athletic build and natural capacity for it. And somebody who has that natural capacity for it will be very good at it. If they know how natural that capacity is, they will be extraordinary at it. And that's the analogy that I like to use.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. it kind of leads into I'll give my kind of application, right, of how
Yes.
to, like, if you're interested in this. So mine is really just to be willing to accept that you have strengths. And I think that this is kind of relates to what you were just saying, Sarah, of, it's hard to accept things that you've been criticized for, kind of those shadow sides or whatever. So we had a workshop, it was a couple months ago now, where we had everybody take StrengthsFinder, and people were going through the results, and this lady kind of afterwards off to the side was just like, I didn't think that I was good at anything, and now like I see that I am. And I think for her, a lot of it was kind of some of that, like being criticized for things, because this is a casino context. She works in compliance, which is like the enemy of everybody anyway. Like no one likes compliance anyway, because they're making you follow the rules. But like all of her strengths were things that made it so that she was good at developing procedures for following rules. And so just for her to be willing to say, oh, like to see that, oh, I am good at these things, and then to be willing to embrace it, was like the first step that she needed. She's going to have to do the work now to figure out what that really means and how she gets them all to fit together. But she had to take this like most basic step of being willing to say, like, I am good at something. And so I guess that's kind of my application. My encouragement is to be willing to just start that journey and not discount yourself as you learn the things that you are good at. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I remember that moment, and it was really interesting, right? Because the strengths of this particular individual, this was my epiphany in that moment too, was they were like the exact opposite of mine, right? I would have absolutely hated her job. Working in compliance would not agree with my strengths at all, right? And the danger is that because of our own bias, we tend to assume that everybody sees the world the way we do, right? So we look at the world through the lens of our own strengths. And it's very easy to dismiss other strengths because we don't necessarily recognize them as strengths. We recognize them as these are the people that are really frustrating to us when they have very opposite strengths of our from us, right? So there's like a twofold realization there of, yes, this is not an area that would be good for me to work in because I wouldn't be good at it. The other realization is, wow, how amazing that this individual has found a role where she can use her strengths that are almost diametrically opposite of mine, and how beautiful that is that we have that kind of diversity. And you can have this individual who now all of a sudden discovers that, oh, I really am in the right place. I get to do the things that I love and that I'm good at. And that is actually a strength, even if other people are mad at our department.
Yeah. And just how much that person is needed, because that role, like, you're going to get in trouble if you don't follow those rules in that context. And so, yeah, just being willing to say, let's all do this together, is really huge.
2 parts about application of that. One is that I mentioned you don't have to necessarily take an assessment to get a clue about your strengths. If you start writing down those satisfying moments, that's the thing about the woman that you're talking about, is that now that she has an idea of where those strengths are, if she starts collecting evidence that they're showing up with intention and well and beautifully in order for her to complete her job and do it well, then she can start to really live in those strengths. And by collecting evidence, I'm coming back to the stories. Your stories are your strengths are your stories. And that's writing down those moments of satisfaction that you get from your work, even if it's as basic as, I found an error in our bookkeeping that was throwing off our books by 14 cents. And that sounds like something that she would find really satisfying. The rest of us would be like, 14 cents? Are you kidding? But if she finds this evidence of where her strength shows up, then that's amazing application to start using them with more intention. The other part of this is not just accepting other people's talents, but incredibly valuing them. And as an example, I worked with a team that generally were very much like this woman, into compliance. They have spreadsheets, they have rules. And there was one person on their team that had 2 strengths in the influencing domain, which is generally the more outgoing, charming people who have command and activator and woo, which is winning others over. So these are people who are the ones that walk into a room and have presence. Those are the people with a lot of the influencing domain. Only one member of their team of 6 had anything in the influencing domain, and he had 2, including woo. And they would complain all the time about him. He just talks to everybody, and he doesn't get his work done. And all he does is he spends his whole day talking to people. And they were so frustrated with him. And I could see, and after walking him through, that he was doing the work. How he did it might have looked different, but he had a stack of paper on his desk that showed that he was actually doing what he was being asked to do. But all they saw was the visiting. They didn't see, because the way he did it didn't look like work to them. He was building relationships in order to have people be compliant. So of course, he left the team because he wasn't being valued for the strengths he brought to it. It wasn't even a week later I heard back.
Yeah.
A week later, they were having to collaborate with another team in the building. And somebody said, well, who do we know in this division? Well, I don't know anyone. Do you know anyone? No one knew him. And somebody said, oh, Ryan would have known who to contact. And suddenly the reality of what they lost hit them. So you have to value those differences. You asked me about being a leader of teams with strengths that are different from mine. Understanding how they're approaching something is a critical factor in their success.
That's a great story. And you kind of see it coming from the outside, but just the ability and willingness to embrace that difference and figure out how to use it for everybody's good, really, in the end.
This has been such a great conversation. And as we start to wrap up here, Ben, what are some final thoughts as you kind of reflect on our conversation today?
My final thought really is a little bit like it always is at the end of these, is just like the practice of talking about these things and reflecting on them is helpful just in this conversation, because we've had these reflections like I've learned about myself, from the things that Sarah has pointed out, from hearing Hannah's perspective. And it's just because we're intentional to sit down and talk about it. So whether you're talking about these things with somebody else, talking about it with your journal, like you said, Sarah, collecting the evidence, just that's my takeaway, is like just to be intentional about learning about it and reflecting on it. And it pays off. Like every time we learn something about ourselves when we do this. What about you, Hannah?
Yeah, I think that's very, very similar for me, right? This whole epiphany of working in complementary strengths, which I've known kind of cognitively that that's a thing that you should do, but I've had this recent experience of experiencing that in real life in this project I'm working on with Ben, which has been super rewarding, where we each can apply our strengths to make something really amazing. And that's just incredibly rewarding, right? And so when we want to, back to our opening here, if you want to love your job, discover your strengths. So as a reminder to all of you listening, you can download the reflection guide that goes along with this episode at magicintheroom.com. I would encourage you, if you haven't taken the Clifton Strengths Assessment, go take it. You can get it on just do a Google search for Clifton Strengths, and it'll take you to the link of Gallup where you can find it. And then hire a coach to help walk you through the results. And so, Sarah, you are a certified Clifton Strengths coach. So I would recommend hire Sarah if you want someone to help you really discover how to apply your strengths and understand the very unique way that you show up because of your strengths and how to use that intentionally to your advantage, to the advantage of the organization you work for, to the advantage of the people that are in your life. So, Sarah, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, first, thank you so much. That was really a thoughtful wrap up. Find me at elkinsconsulting.com. You can find all of my stuff there. You can find my book and my podcast and how to arrange coaching with me. I don't do a lot of individual StrengthsFinder coaching. I really prefer to work with teams, especially in nonprofits and agencies where you see people really struggling with their leadership and not being able to work within their strengths. That communication piece is the critical factor. It's that transparency of being able to understand what language other people are speaking, even when we're all supposedly speaking the same language. So elkinsconsulting.com and on LinkedIn, absolutely. My tagline is "The smile is free."
I love that. And, for those of you who have listened before, that's actually how I met Sarah, was via LinkedIn. So that's another story for another day. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. We are also on LinkedIn and on Facebook. And we are now on Instagram at Purpose and Performance Group. Ben, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I will read us out. Magic in the Room is hosted today by Hannah. Normally Chris and Luke are here, but not today. So today, hosted by Hannah, produced by me, Ben West. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm, and you can find his music on Apple Music. And thank you, Evan, for letting us use your awesome music for our intro and outro. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. And if you want to find past episodes of Magic in the Room, magicintheroom.com is the place to do that. So thank you all, and we'll see you next week.